Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. All right, 2 weeks have now passed since the recent fires in Jerusalem were finally wrestled under control, and the word is still out on whether the sparking of the flames was intentional or negligent. But what is known is the extent of the devastation, and Israeli authorities are now approving of a plan for the rehabilitation of the area. In just a little over 48 hours, 25 square kilometers, nearly 10 square miles of land in Israel destroyed. From August 15th to the 17th, thousands of acres of nature preserves, trails, springs, and heritage sites near Jerusalem, the nation's capital, devastated. Over 2,000 people from over half a dozen communities evacuated, buildings sustaining severe damages, and hundreds of thousands of unique wildlife killed. Nature and Parks authorities predicting that rehabilitation could take decades, but of course, it's never too late to start. Government ministries and nature and heritage authorities approving of a 68 million shekel aid plan to get the ball rolling, and the plan allocating 2.6 million shekels for immediately financing urgent and emergency expenditures, including for lodgings where evacuated residents were temporarily relocated. Then 5 million shekels will pay for clearing asbestos debris as a result of the fire, which the government recognizes as, quote, having a significant environmental impact. Likewise, 400,000 shekels will go towards rehabilitation plans for communities that were damaged in the fire, in cooperation with the Labor and Social Affairs Ministry and the local councils. And finally, the Environmental Protection Ministry has been granted 60 days to come up with a 60 million shekel ecological rehabilitation plan for the open areas, the nature parks, the heritage sites, and so on. And so with this plan, lots of effort and luck. Hopefully, the area's recovery might just bounce back sooner than expected. We begin tonight on the tarmac in Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett boarding his flight back to Israel following his first official meeting as Prime Minister with President Joe Biden. And Bennett describing the weekend talks as warm and effective.
בין הנשיא ביידן לביני נוצר קשר ישיר ואישי, קשר שמושתת על אמון. אנחנו השגנו את כל המטרות שהצבנו לביקור ואף מעבר לכך. סיכמנו עם האמריקאים על עבודה אסטרטגית משותפת לבלימת המרוץ האיראני לגרעין. אנחנו עשינו צעד משמעותי בהצטיידות ובבניין הכוח הישראלי.
But while Bennett leaving the States with a feeling of accomplishment, Iranian leadership stepping further and further away from a negotiated settlement. Ayatollah Khamenei saying that, at least from his perspective, Presidents Biden and Trump are two sides of the same coin.
هم هیچ فرقی با دولت قبلی نداره. یعنی همین چیزی که الان اینا در زمینه مسائل هسته‌ای مطالبه میکنن از ایران همون چیزی است که ترامپ مطالبه میکرد که اون روز مسئولین بالای دولتی میگفتن که امکان نداره، عاقلانه نیست و فلان. امروز اینا همون رو میخوان، هیچ تفاوتی نکرد. او با یه زبان میگفت، اینا با یه زبان.
Now, meantime, as Prime Minister Bennett gets ready to return to Israel from D.C., Israeli defense forces fighting off an incursion from the Gaza Strip.
במהלך הלילה צה"ל תקף בעזה בתגובה על הפרחת הבלונים. כמו שאני כבר אמרתי, אנחנו נפעל בעזה לפי האינטרס שלנו, ומבחינתי הכתובת בעזה הייתה ונשארה חמאס.
Israeli fighter jets hitting 2 Hamas-affiliated sites in the Gaza Strip Sunday morning, including a military weapons manufacturing plant and training facility and the entrance to a cross-border terror tunnel. And this after Palestinians from the Strip resumed their intensive violence along the security fence over the weekend, complete with incendiary balloons and nighttime harassment operations. Operations which, despite their title, are among the most violent Hamas-run programs, with operatives often throwing explosives and shooting towards Israeli soldiers and nearby communities. Hamas saying their intentions are to pressure Israel into lifting the blockade, which both Israel and Egypt have maintained since Hamas's violent takeover in 2007. That said, Hamas actually is increasing its violence in recent weeks, despite Israel acquiescing to most of the terror group's demands in efforts to finalize a ceasefire agreement. In fact, Israel has reopened border crossings, is increasing the number of employment permits for Gazans who want to work in Israel, is allowing the resumption of Qatari aid and more. And Jerusalem, for its part, is just calling for the return of the remains of 2 dead soldiers and for the freedom of 2 more Israeli civilians thought captive in Gaza for 6 years. For the second night in a row, Palestinians from Gaza rioting along the Israeli border, and the violence, including tire-burning, arson, and hurling stones and explosives towards Israel, staged by the Hamas terror group. Hamas saying that the riots are intended to pressure Israel into easing the blockade around the Strip after restrictions were tightened following the war with Hamas in May. However, Israel's restrictions are set up to prevent Hamas from building up its military, while literally tons of aid are still flowing in through the crossings every day. And Hamas is notably refraining from pressuring Egypt, which maintains the other half of the blockade around Gaza. The IDF then responding to the increased tensions with additional troop deployments, and they responded to the Palestinians rioting with tear gas, stun grenades, and at times live fire. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry reporting 18 injuries. As for Israeli injuries, 21-year-old border police officer Barel Shmueli passing away Wednesday afternoon after lying in serious condition in Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. Shmueli was shot in the head at point-blank range a little over a week ago when Palestinian rioters rushed the border. His condition deteriorating Sunday, ending today with his death. Meantime, in related news, one of Hamas's victims actually defying all odds and is coming back to life. Yulia Zalotsky, who was critically injured during the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas in early May, now bucking her doctor's predictions and is set to be discharged. The 44-year-old single mother from Holon, Israel, was given just hours to live after a rocket fired by Hamas terrorists landed on a bus just feet away from where she was standing. Huge chunks of shrapnel sent careening in Zalotsky's direction. And it was just the second day out of 11 days of heavy conflict, with Hamas and other Palestinian terror groups indiscriminately launching over 4,000 rockets towards civilian communities in Israel. In any case, after rushing to the hospital suffering from shrapnel wounds and massive blood loss, Zalotsky was left comatose and in critical condition. But following 2 months in a coma and over a dozen complex surgeries, including one to amputate her left leg, Zalotsky finally woke up. And now, 3 weeks after opening her eyes, she's ready to head on home to continue with her recovery. Zalotsky saying that she's full of hope and that the idea of someday walking on her own with a prosthesis is keeping her motivated. In other news, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett now weighing whether or not to offer transport assistance to the United States in Afghanistan. The reported offer intended to help with the evacuation and resettlement of refugees and asylum seekers to third-party nations. To be clear, Israel would not be landing directly in Afghanistan, nor is Israel offering to absorb Afghani refugees who are fleeing from the Taliban. In fact, if the plan were okayed, sources say refugees would not even step foot on Israeli soil. But Israel is considering helping in the airlifting process of moving refugees from U.S. military bases in Qatar and Kuwait to a third country for permanent resettlement. And according to anonymous sources, the idea was reportedly initiated as a possible gesture of goodwill from the new Israeli government towards the Biden administration. Still, the idea is not yet set in stone, with one source telling the Times of Israel that, quote, the proposal is still in flux. And a spokesman from the Prime Minister's office even denying that the proposal was even considered at all. That said, if Israel does agree, it wouldn't be the first time Jerusalem helped in such a crisis. But whatever the case, officials had better decide fast. Hundreds of Americans and thousands of Afghans are still stuck in the country, with the deadline for evacuation just 24 hours away. And Islamist groups like the Taliban and ISIS are rapidly increasing their violent terror. The most recent attacks including suicide bombings and rockets targeting U.S. troops and Kabul airport.
First of all, on behalf of the Israeli people, I want to extend our condolences and deep sadness for the loss of American lives in Kabul. The American service members lost their lives while on a mission to save other people's lives. And that's the very definition of courage and sacrifice. May they rest in peace. Especially on this day, I want to be crystal clear. Israel always stands together with the United States of America, unequivocally.
Moving on, good news and bad news on the coronavirus front in Israel. The good news is that the positivity rate seems to be waning again just shortly after surpassing 7%. And this as the effect of third-dose booster vaccines are seemingly starting to truly kick in. But the bad news is that the hard-fought gains may be reversing, and soon. The school year, for one, is slated to begin on Wednesday, with Health Ministry Director General Nachman Ash saying that he believes that no more lockdowns are on the way and that students in Israel will study in person for more days than they did last year. Yet over 3,000 students just tested positive for COVID over the weekend, and over 130,000 more students and school staff are currently in quarantine. Meantime, whether under lockdown or not, make sure to keep your masks on and stay away from crowds during the coming high holiday season, because while the Delta variant appears to be under control, several new variants are raising concerns, particularly the C.1.2 variant, which was first detected in South Africa but has since spread to England, Europe, China, parts of Africa, Mauritius, and New Zealand. Scientists believe the new variant to be substantially mutated from its predecessor, with an evolution rate of about 42 mutations per year. That's nearly double the rate of any other strain. And researchers are still trying to figure out, however, what the impacts of these mutations are, as well as whether or not C.1.2 has a competitive advantage over the currently more dominant Delta variant. Now, in other news, the COVID infection rate in Israel around the highest it's ever been. So while Israeli authorities may be feeling confident about the nation's recovery, allied countries are keeping Israelis at a safe distance. Hannah Rifkin with the report.
The European Union officially deciding to remove Israel from its safe travel list. And likewise, several other nations, including the US, Kosovo, Lebanon, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, also booted from the EU's safe travel listing, meaning travelers can expect to face tighter controls when heading there. The good news, though, the 27 countries in the EU bloc are not obligated to follow the Union's guidance, so they're ultimately free to determine their own border and travel policies, which may vary. Additionally, people who are vaccinated and can prove it will still be admitted into Israel to visit. The only problem with that is that visitors to Israel can only forego isolation upon arrival if they've been vaxxed in Israel. And this despite a new Israeli report concluding that forcing arrivals from abroad into isolation may not even be all that effective in stemming the spread of infection. Then finally, to make matters worse, regardless of final regulations, thousands of tourist entry requests are backed up, sitting unanswered as travel restrictions were up in the air. And this as the high holiday season just around the corner, which is typically an extremely significant period for Israel's tourism economy. Hannah Rifkin, ILTV.
Moving on, it's time to head back to Tokyo for our latest Paralympics update. Israeli athletes still kicking butt and taking names in some events as we enter day 7 of the 2020 Summer Games. Hannah Rifkin with the details.
It's now been a week since the start of the 2020-2021 Paralympic Games in Tokyo, Japan. And the Israeli team, just 33 members strong, setting 3 world records and earning an impressive 7 medals, 4 golds, 2 silvers, and a bronze. As for the winners in question, the latest medals again coming from swimming. Ami Dadaon, for one, taking gold in the men's 200-meter freestyle on Monday and setting a new world record in the process. Dadaon competes in the S4 disability category and completed the race in 2 minutes and 44.84 seconds, 6 seconds faster than the previous record. And this is Dadaon's second medal from this year's Games, having also won silver in the 150-meter medley. Meanwhile, Israeli swimmer Mark Maliyar similarly winning his 3rd medal at this year's Paralympics, a bronze for finishing the 100-meter backstroke final in 1 minute and 10.08 seconds. Though the first 2 medals were gold, after Maliyar finished first and broke world records in both the 200-meter medley and the 400-meter freestyle, and this in the SM7 disability category. Then finally, with the gold earned by Israeli Arab swimmer Iyad Shalabi and the silver medal earned by Moran Samuel for rowing, Israel's tally sits at a strong 7. Of course, again, the games are not over yet.
In related news, an Israeli medical breakthrough may soon provide the key to protecting elderly populations from severe infections, including with COVID-19. And the secret? Simple. Just de-age and rejuvenate the body's immune system. Publishing their results in the peer-reviewed journal Blood, Technion Institute researchers Professor Doron Melamed and doctoral student Rem Dori set out to understand why the elderly were so much more susceptible to severe cases of COVID-19, as well as why vaccines seem to be less effective on them and wane more quickly. And what they discovered is astounding. First, the team found that B cells, or B lymphocytes, which are responsible for identifying pathogens and producing antibodies to destroy them, divide into 2 categories. Raw B cells are produced to encounter new pathogens, and then they become memory B cells, which remember specific previously encountered pathogens. But that's not all. The team also discovered that the body maintains a stagnant number of these B cells, which means that once a raw cell converts to a memory cell, there will be fewer raw cells to identify new pathogens. Thus, the elderly have fewer raw cells to fight off novel infections like coronavirus. So what's the solution? Well, the researchers found that they could override this system in one of two ways. First, by using specific hormone blockers, which trick the body into thinking that there are fewer memory cells. And the second, by literally depleting the patient of their memory B cells. Either way, the body responds by rejuvenating the immune system and restarting raw B cell production. Of course, while the study has produced incredible results so far, there's more studying to do. So researchers suggest that in the meantime, doctors rely on other means to protect the elderly, like frequent vaccinations every 3 to 4 months. In other news, we head back in time now to Lithuania of old. Excavation teams uncovering incredible artifacts from the Great Synagogue of Vilna. And for the first time since the synagogue was destroyed by both the Nazis and the Soviets over 60 years ago.
היה לו רצפה כוכב של עמד במרכז בית הכנסת לפני ארון הקודש. כאשר אנחנו עוברים לצד, אנחנו רואים את המדרגות שעלו לארון הקודש, מדרגות שנהרסו, כאמור, על ידי הנאצים והסובייטים.
The Israeli-Lithuanian excavation expedition, waking the world over the weekend with new evidence of the centuries-old Jewish life from Vilna, Lithuania. And the excavations focused on none other than the Great Synagogue complex of Vilna, also known as the Shulhoif, which at one point boasted 12 synagogues and prayer halls, a community council building, kosher meat stalls, a seminary, a very famous library, and more. Nearly all of it destroyed, though, looted and burned by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And then in 1956-57, the Soviets demolished what remained, making way for a modern school that's since been built on the campus. Still, history finding a way to reveal itself. Archaeologists now exposing remnants of the Aron HaKodesh, or the Torah Ark, and the Bima, or the altar from the Great Synagogue of Vilna, for the first time since the Holocaust. And that's not all. Most recently, a silver yad, or hand-shaped pointer used to read from the Torah, was found over the weekend. Also, 2 impressive staircases seen in images of the synagogue from before its destruction were discovered. The entire facade of the altar has been completely excavated, and one of the 4 massive pillars that supported the roof has been exposed.
כאן בבית הכנסת אנחנו רואים את העמוד הגדול, שאחד מ4 עמודים שעמדו בבית הכנסת. אנחנו עוברים כאן במבט אל הבימה, הבימה הגדולה שנבנתה על ידי היסוד במאה ה-17, ומתחת לבימת בית הכנסת מרתף גדול שהיה שייך ככל נראה לבית כנסת המקורי, שנבנה כאן עוד במאה ה-16 או תחילת ה-17. בתוכו מצאנו לפני שנה כתובת מרהיבה שמסבירה איך היהודים מווילנה עלו ארצה לארץ ישראל כחלק מהעלייה של היישוב הישן.
The Great Synagogue of Vilna was built in the 17th century in the Renaissance Baroque style, and it stood for roughly 350 years before its erasure. Now to our final story tonight. The Jewish high holidays are upon us, but after the last year under the shadow of the pandemic, far from the normal festive meals, many are finding themselves reaching out to charity organizations just to put basic food on the table. So thankfully, there are those organizations who hear these people's pleas, and among them is Yad Ezra V'Shulamit, which aims to feed the poor and otherwise help the needy. They just can't do it alone. So joining me now with how we can help, ILTV reporter Asaf Nissan. Asaf, thanks so much for being with us and this is a very important topic, really. What happened that we see such a rise in the need for charity this year? Because weren't there programs to help prevent people from falling below the poverty line?
There were programs there, Aaron. For always are programs, but in the end of the day, the problem is those programs are prone to fall, prone to be buried under red tape, under a lot of bureaucracy. So you cannot promise exactly that those plans will come to fruition. And even then, not all of them are optional to get the same help, the same monetary compliance, the same meals. The fact is, because those programs have very specific terms and conditions, those limit you pretty much to how much you can contribute to.
All right, so is this something that, how long-term of a problem do we expect this to be in terms of the rate of poverty and how it's grown and whether or not it will be reduced? And what is Yad Ezra V'Shulamit planning to do for the holidays this year to help out as much as they can?
So unfortunately, we're not going to see we're going to see this as a long-term effect because we are still experiencing and yet to experience the effects of the COVID-19 virus. And we are seeing it's not over with the different variants. So I would say this is a long-term problem that won't go away this easily, but thank God for organizations like Gaza and Shulamit who are coming to help. And what they're planning this year is actually raising for Rosh Hashanah and for the high holy days, 50,000 meals. This is part, of course, of their natural program to help in any other way possible, like food, clothing, schools, and even community centers for different types of programs in society. But in the end of the day, they still want to make sure people have the food on the table, and this is their most important term and condition for, of course, to make everything work.
So for people who are maybe donating to them, because of course this Rav Shulamit is working on donations, could the donations be made as one-time payments or maybe spread payments out, things like that? I know in Israel we have tashlumim,
which basically, I mean, Israelis love that, and of course it's optional for everyone who wants to donate. It doesn't have to be a one-time thing. It could be even a six-month program or maybe even a yearly program.
So you could potentially, if a single investment might be a little too much, you could spread them out.
Exactly, or in case you want to support a whole family throughout the year. Wow. A lot of organizations, and I know Yad Azlan Shulamit also, they support specific families throughout the year, and a monthly donation every month to make sure that family has food on their table.
All right. So, final question. Where do we go if we want to help out?
So what we need to do is just go to the website Yad Azlan Shulamit. There, you're going to have the option to donate, and as much as you feel like you need, and as much as you can give, hopefully getting to the point where we get to 50,000 meals by Rosh Hashanah.
All right. Asaf Nissan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.